So what will we cover in prevention? During this section, I'm covering a number of key items in relation to preventing fly strike. This includes identifying when fly strike risk is highest, what makes sheep susceptible to fly strike, and how to prevent fly strike. We will also have time at the end of this section for a few questions as we move through. So when is fly strike highest? There are three basic conditions for fly strike to occur. Firstly is the presence of susceptible sheep. Next, we have the presence of flies. And the third condition required is favourable weather conditions. And they're the kind of cornerstones of today's kind of mindset. We're going to start with weather. Weather conditions play a big role in determining the risk of fly strike. The risk of fly strike is greatest during warm and wet conditions. This usually coincides with spring and autumn, but it can occur throughout the year if climatic conditions make sheep more susceptible to fly strike and favour fly reproduction. So the Australian sheep blowfly activity increases when temperature is above 15 degrees, but they're most active between 26 and 36 degrees. They don't like wind, and so they like wind speeds less than 9 kilometres, and fly activity stops completely when wind is greater than 30 kilometres an hour. They like rainfall to be regular and consistent, and the reason this is that the strike risk increases dramatically when there's enough rain to keep the sheep's skin moist for 2 or more days. So frequent small falls of rain are more conducive to fly strike than the occasional heavy fall because there's less opportunity for the skin to dry out. High-risk regions are predominantly in southern Australia, particularly in southern Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales. So that's the weather conditions required for a strike. The next condition we'll talk about is the presence of flies. So you'll hear more about this culprit, but know thy enemy, and we're going to work through today's presentation, but this is Lucilia caprina. It's a pretty name, but this fly, generally known as the Australian sheep blowfly, is responsible for 90% of fly strike in sheep. As you can see, it's a very distinctive looking blowfly. After the Australian sheep blowfly has initiated a strike, other species of fly may attack the animal and can cause additional damage, which is sometimes more severe. The final requirement for fly strike is susceptible sheep. Some sheep are more inclined to be struck than others and are at more risk than others. The number of susceptible sheep is a key factor in influencing the extent of fly strike in a mob. The more sheep at risk in the mob, the greater risk of a fly wave occurring. So, what makes sheep susceptible to fly strike? Sheep that are more likely to be struck by flies are those that have breech wrinkles, long wool in the breech area, dags caused by scouring, urine stain, wool that is yellow, have suffered fleece rot or dermatitis, have wet or moist wool and skin. Particularly, this increases the risk of body strike. Horns, wounds, any wounds, for example, caused by skin tears, abscesses, dog bites, foot rot, all increase the risk of fly strike. Basically, all of these, any wounds and moist skin will attack blowflies. Sheep that have been struck in the past may also be more susceptible to another strike. Flies use scent to find the sheep, so wet sheep or those with an existing strike are more attractive to them. Young sheep like weaners are generally more likely to get struck, especially those that are unclassed. This is a high risk category. These young guys and girls are also the most at high risk of dermatitis and fleece rot as well. So how to prevent a fly strike? So let's have a look at this, and we want to avoid the panic. Remember, prevention is better than cure. Having an integrated plan with broad-ranging tools helps minimize strike without the over-reliance on chemicals. Preventative activities which help reduce the risk of fly strike include classing and modifying sheep, which includes breeding and selecting sheep which are less susceptible to fly strike, as well as mulesing high-risk sheep and docking lamb's tails to optimum length when marking. Shearing and crutching to reduce wool length, so wool dries out more quickly, particularly around the breech. This also reduces the prevalence of dags. applying preventative chemicals to sheep to protect against strike, reducing the risk of scouring, which causes dag, and careful selection of paddocks, all reduce fly populations. And it's really one of those key things. Now let's look at each of these preventative activities. So selecting and breeding sheep which are less susceptible to fly strike is a good long-term strategy to minimize fly strike. This includes selecting for low breech wrinkle and wool cover and low incidence of dags and stain. Culling sheep which have been previously been struck is also advisable. So AWI and MLA Visual Score Guide has some great examples of the type of sheep that would be high risk of fly strike. This guide can be used to assist in selecting and classing out sheep in order to prevent long-term fly strike. So this first page, and this is all in the, for anyone who's watching me, but on the visual score guides, it's really easy to download and one of a great resource. This first picture shows the various degrees of breech wrinkle. The next one shows dags, followed by urine stain, and breech cover, which is how much naturally bare skin is there around the breech. You can see here that those sitting at around score 3 or greater are going to be at the increasing risk of fly strike. So you would use these scores as a guide for removing higher risk sheep in your flock. If you deem the risk of fly strike in your sheep is high and they require mulesing, ensure the best practice procedures are used. These two guides are available from AWI, which will help. The first is a training guide to help you plan, prepare, and conduct best welfare land practices and marking opportunity. Remember, you are sheep surgeons, and all surgeons use anesthetics and analgesia. That's best practice. The second is a guide to provide assistance when you're planning a non-mules merino enterprise. Another long-term preventative activity relates to docking lamb's tails to an optimum length when marking. Wool that is stained or wet from urine and feces can attract flies. So there's an optimal tail length which helps channel urine and feces away from the breech area. This also minimizes stain around the breech and reduces fly risk throughout the sheep's life. Appropriate tail length also helps prevent prolapse, which is common in sheep with very short tails, and protects soft tissue from cancers caused by sun exposure. So when marking lambs, the recommended tail length ensures the heel tail just covers the vulva. This means docking the tail below the third palpable joint or through the third joint space. Palpable is a nice classy way of saying it just means the joint that we can easily feel. Male lambs should have their tails docked to the same length as ewe lambs. The length is important because it means there's enough muscle remains that the sheep can lift the tail high in the air, which puts vertical tension on the breech skin, which makes the channel for urine and avoid the wool. So a short-term preventative activity for fly strike is shearing and crutching. These activities can provide up to 6 weeks protection from body and breech strike. If sheep are scouring, however, this protection is reduced to about 3 weeks. Shearing and crutching should be planned to coincide with the start or just before the usual start of the fly season. Why we do this? This is to reduce the number of susceptible sheep when the fly becomes active after winter. This is particularly important for lambing ewes that may have more stain around the breech. So carefully consider the timing of shearing and crutching. Aim to extend the period of protection over the fly season as much as possible by spacing out these activities. Remember, shearing and crutching will give you 6 weeks. Bearing in mind the usual high-risk periods for flies in your area and other critical events such as lambing. Handling ewes with lambs at foot to crutch can be difficult, so time your activities to avoid having to do this. Applying preventative chemicals. Insecticides can be used in combination with other preventative activities to deter flies, but they shouldn't be relied on alone. These chemicals are registered to be used either as a preventative or to treat struck sheep, which is called dressings. Some chemicals only provide protection and won't kill maggots. That's really important. We'll cover treating fly strike further in this session. So it's vital you get the right chemical for the task and follow the label instructions. So fly boss tools are really handy to help with your chemical selection. www.flyboss.com.au, and you go in there and there's some really easy tools, and you can see where you can just click on long wool, short wool, and it really helps you guide some of those decisions, but also understand how those chemical works and also the withholding periods and when you should and shouldn't use them. Preventative chemicals may only work if there's at least 1 month's wool growth for the chemical to bond. So applying chemicals after shearing or off the board may not provide the protection expected of the product. As we said earlier, where possible, time applications to extend the protection period. For example, if you're shearing in early December, applying a preventative chemical 6 weeks later in mid-January will help to protect the sheep when the wool becomes long again. When considering a chemical treatment, check withholding periods and intervals. Remember, it's important to keep accurate records of any of the chemical treatments used for. A real challenge is that if you're getting caught out and you're so close to crutching or shearing. So there is a chemical spinosad that can be used tactically, that it has the very minimal withhold, that if you're getting caught out and you don't want to move that shearing crutching date, you can apply. The resistance to flies to chemicals is a growing concern. This is because resistance reduces the effectiveness of preventative chemicals and treatments or dressings over time. If wool growers already have a resistance on their property, this could result in shorter periods of protection than they would normally expect, rather than a complete loss of effectiveness. So that's why it's so important to use the right chemical for the task and rotate chemicals wherever possible. So it's so important to ensure you get a full coverage. You've got to follow the label instructions for dosage rates and application methods. Remember, there's different concentrations and brand names for the same chemical, and it's a real trap to kind of fall into. So make sure you're looking at what the active ingredient is. Next, we want to calibrate our application equipment regularly, as this will help ensure the right dose is applied. So, it's really vital that we don't overdose or underdose, and the steps I've just mentioned will help ensure that this doesn't occur. So poor efficacy, or how well the chemical worked, is often attributed to resistance, where in fact the real issue in some applications will be about how we used it, when we used it, the dose rate, or the timing of application. So we're going to have a little bit of a break for the poll now. This poll is about your property and whether you think preventative chemicals work, or if you think you've got a resistant problem. So you've got to be honest, it's tempting to blame resistant on other management issues, but they might be a play. Remember, the poll's anonymous, and the poll should come up on the screen in front of you.
So yep, that poll's up now live, Tim.
Oh, great. Well, everyone quickly put in. Talking about instruction manuals, I bought a smart TV on last weekend. It's still sitting in the packet. I thought about when I was looking at this slide, I thought, that's not really smart, is it? But I think a lot of our chemicals are the same. We don't look at the label and we don't read the instructions properly.
We'll just give everyone just a couple more seconds. Tim, now 3, 2, 1. And we'll just pop the results up on screen now. Are those in front of you, Tim?
Yep, I've got them now. So from the survey, guys, 49% think they've got that preventive chemical still work on your property for the protection period on the label. We've got 11% say no, and then I suppose from the industry, we've got a few other there. So we're still getting a lot of, I suppose, labelled protection in the industry. And, you'll see December's beyond the bail, actually. There's some good articles in there to see about how that might change in different states. So thanks for that, everyone. So we'll just go back to the slideshow. Okay, so For the 49% of you that have answered that you think chemicals still work on your property, there is a really great resource available which covers how strategically to manage the use of chemical treatments to reduce the risk of resistance problem developing. Remember, we want to, prevention is always better than cure, and we want to make sure we get the longest time we possibly can with the chemicals available. So essentially, if you don't have a resistance problem, you don't want to develop one. This fact sheet will give you some tips about how to avoid just that. Now, for those you think that you've already got a resistance problem developing on your property, there is another resource available for you which covers other strategies you can use to limit the development of further resistance on your property. And they're both really some great handouts. You can both download these fact sheets from the FlyBoss website. All you got to do is search resistant management strategies, and it's really easy to find. So, guys, we've discussed classing and modifying sheep, which includes breeding, selecting sheep which are less susceptible to fly strike, as well as mulesing high-risk sheep and docking tails of lambs to the optimum length when marking. We've covered shearing and crutching to reduce the wool length so the wool dries quickly. And we've touched on applying preventative chemicals to sheep to protect against strike. Now it's time to consider the rest of our strategies we've got at hand. Reducing the risk of scouring, which causes dags, careful selection of paddocks, and reducing fly populations. So what can we do to reduce scouring? Scouring can cause dags to form rapidly. Dags then cause wool and skin around the breech to stay moist and warm. This creates an odor which attracts the gravid fly looking to lay eggs. This environment provides a suitable site for the female to lay her eggs and for maggots to develop. So preventing scouring and dags is an important step to improve animal welfare, but also reduce the risk of breech strike. So worms can cause scouring, so controlling the risk of scouring is an important preventative activity. If you live in an area where there's a high risk of dags occurring, add lowering dags to your breeding objective as one of your breeding objectives. To control worms, you really need to, firstly, monitor worm populations using fecal egg counts and drench when required. It's really important. I had a client last week with a fecal egg count of 2,000 eggs per gram. The sheep looked okay, but using that fecal egg count is an excellent tool to find out what's happening. When we're drenching, remember to use the right drench for the right job and the right dose. We want to make sure that we're rotating drenches and using drenches with multi-actives where possible. More information from this can be found on the Worm Boss website. And of course, avoiding sudden changes in diet that may induce scouring, such as the introduction of grain, which can cause acidosis, or forage crops. All of these steps help reduce risk of dags. So what about paddocks? So there's, by putting more susceptible sheep in certain paddocks is another key prevention activity. Selecting paddocks that help mitigate the environmental factors that contribute to fly strike and avoid hotspots that encourage fly activity. So this might include paddocks that are more open and exposed to wind. Remember, flies hate the wind. And those with less timber and wet areas. Fly activity, hopefully in these paddocks, will be reduced, but also the sheep will dry out more quickly. Avoid paddocks that may be contaminated with large worm populations. For example, those have been recently grazed during the fly season. This will help prevent the scouring, which will again prevent the dags. The final preventative activity I'll cover is focused on reducing the presence of flies. The Australian sheep blowfly female prefers to lay its eggs on live sheep. Damp, smelly wool is their ideal environment. So a female can lay 300 eggs every 4 to 8 days. So you can see how this can quickly explode into a fly wave and really escalate. Within 12 to 24 hours, the eggs hatch into maggots or larvae, which grow by feeding on the sheep through wounds, the existing strike, and weepy skin. The maggots then drop off the sheep in about 3 days, and then they burrow into the ground to pupate before emerging as immature flies a week later, depending on the temperature. Now, To complete their life cycle, larvae need to feed on a feed that's rich in protein to commence their life cycle. So sources of protein include the exudate from the wounds, existing strike, weeping skin, but also carcasses and things like protein-rich manure. Now, other fly species that cause that secondary infection may also use these sources of protein, but also include household waste to lay eggs and to hatch maggots. So the whole show can get done in 17 to 21 days. So reducing the presence of flies from the equation can help prevent strike in the first place. So I kind of think of it like, the snowball rolling down the hill, it turns in the avalanche. We want to get on top of the fly numbers before they become a problem. So some key points in reducing the presence of flies. Firstly, we want to remove and dispose of any fleece or waste material, waste animal matter, dags, dirty wool, horn tips, tails, etc. We want to eliminate these as a source of protein for both the Australian sheep blowfly and other flies. Carcasses of sheep that have died from fly strike should be removed and disposed of. Although carcasses aren't a big part of the life cycle for the Australian sheep blowfly, many maggots are able to complete their life cycle before those other fly species come and infect the carcass and outcompete them. Collecting maggots from the wool clippings when you've treated an animal is also super important. It may not be something you really automatically think about, but doing this helps reduce the number of flies and can prevent a fly wave. Remember, prevention is better than treatment, so we want to get on top of the fly numbers before they escalate. So flies don't travel that far. They generally travel about 3 kilometres, so managing them at isolated sites and at a property level can actually make a significant difference to the level of fly strike on individual properties, but also in the local area. Importantly, these activities help reduce fly populations, should be timed before the emergence of flies from the pupa stage, not just within the fly season. So reducing the sources of reduce the feed source by disposing of fleece, waste matter, and carcasses is important before the temperatures reach 15 degrees. So it's something we want to do the all year round. That is not towards the end of winter, but not just once spring has sprung and we think about flies, so the whole year round. So if you starve the newly emerged flies, you slow the population reproductive rate over the next few months. So at the start of the season, we want to get on the attack. We want to keep that number so low. So by the end of your fly season, your local population size of flies and therefore your fly pressure will be lower. So then you'll have even less flies that to survive over the next winter and emerge the following winter and spring when the temperature comes over 15 degrees. So that covers the full range of prevention activities. Remember, a combination of these activities is best rather than trying to rely on any single activity alone. Now, to summarize what we've just discussed for prevention, a well-timed preventative activities can help reduce the risk of fly strike and the development of fly waves. Some types and classes of sheep, particularly young sheep, are more susceptible to fly strike and should be targeted for preventative treatment. A well thought out integrated fly strike program is required. Make sure you have a plan which includes preventative activities we've covered today. No single preventative activity should be relied upon alone. Make sure that you use a range of well-timed activities in combination, and the prevention of fly strike should be included in a broader fly strike management plan which considers monitoring and treatment activities